Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 19 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Pittsburgh Penguins and lost by a score of 4-3 in the shootout. If that score seems familiar, it's because it is, as it is the exact score that the Sharks lost to the Philadelphia Flyers just a few days ago. In fact, it actually played out in a very similar fashion to that game, as here tonight the Sharks also fell behind quite early on. Brian Rust, just a couple of minutes into this game, made it 1-0 Pittsburgh. Then it seemed as though it was 2-0 with an Evgeny Malkin goal that would end up getting called off on the offside. However, the Penguins would respond again with a goal from Puljujarvi, and as such it was indeed 2-0 Pittsburgh at the end of the first period. In the second, Sidney Crosby would score his 599th career goal to make it 3-0, and that was finally the moment that the Sharks actually woke up a little bit and would get a goal back here on the board, a goal on the power play from Tyler Toffoli to make it 3-1. In the third period, they would manage to complete that comeback like they did a few nights ago against the Philadelphia Flyers with a goal from Mikael Granlund and then Toffoli's second of the game, and it would be 3-3. But yet to draw another parallel to that Flyers game, in that one after Barclay Goodrow had scored the game-tying goal, the Sharks then leaned back and relaxed for their next shift, and immediately the Flyers pressured hard, and the Sharks had to rely on their goaltender to make multiple great saves to keep the tie alive and force that one into the overtime. Here tonight, they again do that exact same thing and have to rely on Blackwood to make not one but two incredible saves to keep this a 3-3 game and end up going into the overtime. This time around, the Sharks did not have an entire 2-minute power play to work with. In the overtime, Macklin Celebrini did not randomly get punched in the face by a Penguins player, and so it was instead Pittsburgh who dominated those 5 minutes of 3-on-3 play. The Sharks had a chance or two, but it was mostly Penguins controlled. They had possession of the puck at least 70 or 80% of the time, and Blackwood had to come up with at least 3 or 4 incredible saves in that 5-minute period to keep the Sharks alive and force it into the shootout. The San Jose Sharks would see some improvement in the shootout here with goals from Granlund and Eklund, but still both Celebrini and Smith stonewalled by Penguins goaltender Nedeljkovic, and that would lead to the Sharks' loss in the 5th round of the shootout here to Pittsburgh. Before we get into the players to talk about, one thing that I do want to mention here, as fun as it is to see the Sharks manage to make these comebacks and come back from 3 goals down, and it gets you excited that this is a never say die type of team, at the end of the day, you can't just continuously fall behind like this. You want to actually show up to play from minute 1 and not have to wait until you're like a couple of goals behind to try to mount that comeback, because while it is possible to do against the weaker teams of the NHL like Pittsburgh, like Philadelphia, who had a similar level to San Jose, when you go up against the better teams like, for instance, the previous game against the New York Rangers, even being behind a couple of goals makes it very, very difficult to come back in those games. We saw the Sharks have that struggle against the Rangers. They were down 3-1 heading into the into the third period, just as they were here tonight, but they only managed to get 1 goal on the board from Zetterlund in the last 30 seconds, and they would end up losing it in regulation. So coming in down a goal or down a couple of goals or down 3 goals or whatever the case may be going into the third period, that's not a recipe for success. Obviously that's like Captain Obvious here, but still it feels as though the Sharks are only waking up in these games when they're forced to do so, instead of actually playing that full 60 minutes, which we have rarely if ever seen this season thus far. When it comes to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Eklund, Granlund, and Zetterlund. So this is the only line that doesn't undergo any changes compared to last game, and I would now consider them to be the Sharks top line based on the changes that have been otherwise made with these 12 forwards. And you know, who could really blame Morsovsky for keeping these 3 players together? As we have seen time and time again, they do work very, very well together. There's a lot of synergy here between these 3 players. We saw that on the 1 goal that they do manage to score from Mikael Granlund. Granlund, that great pass out to William Eklund there near the blue line. He then makes a strong pass off the wall to Zetterlund, who makes a good one over to Granlund, who then somehow manages to score here. It didn't look like there was much of an opportunity, and yet he still managed to put that one in. So when this line is rolling, they do manage to find a lot of success. It was a game that was kind of similar to the one they had against the Rangers just last game, in which they weren't always dominant, but when they could get that time in the offensive zone, they managed to play very, very well. From an individual sense, we'll start off with William Eklund here, who continues to impress. His work along the boards is integral to the way this line actually works, and it reminds me back in the earlier parts of Eklund's career, just a few seasons ago at this point, where Eklund, he was willing at times to get into those board battles, but he would not really find much success in that area. And it was thought, oh, well, as a smaller player, is he going to be more of a perimeter guy? Is he going to be someone who kind of stays out of the nitty-gritty plays along the walls and just tries to benefit from that? And Eklund has developed in the complete opposite direction. He is someone who is not only willing, but actively thrives in these board battles and is able to come up with the puck more times than not, which has made him a very, very effective player. And this is a great sign for not just the San Jose Sharks in the immediate present, but also in the future. One major thing when it comes to actually making it in the postseason is that there's not a lot of open space on the ice. You need to be able to win those board battles. And so having a more perimeter guy like Eklund could have been would have not been super useful compared to having someone who is willing to get into those dirty areas and retrieve the puck. So Eklund, it is a great situation that it has gone this way for him. His willingness to actually get in there and fight for the puck is very much admired. So he is definitely a big part of this Lund line. But the reason why they managed to have such synergy together is that when one plays well, the others are also playing well. And that's exactly the case here with Granlund and Zetterlund. Good games for both of them. Granlund, some slick plays in the offensive zone as he continuously manages to do. Zetterlund, I will actually appreciate his defensive play here tonight. He had a great back check in the second period to completely interrupt a Penguins play and was also rather solid in the offensive zone. Really, it wasn't an incredible game for these three players, but they still put together a solid effort tonight. The one thing that should be noted, as this will actually relate to the point I'm about to make, is that by Warsofsky keeping together these three players, it has slightly exposed the lack of depth that the Sharks do have in their top nine, which has led to the following problem. If we take a look at the Sharks' second line, we finally see Celebrini and Will Smith put together. Every single Sharks fan excited to see what these two players can actually work, and the magic was there on occasion here tonight. The problem is that they are joined on this line by Barclay Goodrow. Now, I was somewhat complimentary of Goodrow in his previous outing against the New York Rangers. I talked about how he actually played decently well and had a few good chances for himself. But the thing is that for that to happen, the stars had to align, the planets had to align, all of the celestial bodies in the universe had to be working in perfect harmony just for Goodrow to not be a liability in the Sharks' top six. But that's not going to happen on every day. The universe is quite chaotic in that sense. And so Goodrow being on this second line with Celebrini and Will Smith, it just doesn't work here. You know, we look at that first period, and this is the one shift that's really going to stand out in everybody's mind for the San Jose Sharks, because it was just so incredibly impressive to see what Smith and Celebrini were able to do in that one shift of that first period. And you do also have to give commendations to both Thrun and Ceci, who also worked quite well with those two players on the back end. But Goodrow was clearly the odd man out, that when the few times, because it seemed as though maybe they weren't actively doing so, but they kind of seemed to be avoiding Goodrow and actually getting the puck to him, the few times he did manage to get possession, he would just make the incorrect play. There was one where he looked to make the pass to Celebrini, but it was way too far behind him. I think the play eventually ended up dying on this shift because of a mistake by Barclay Goodrow. But it wasn't just on that one shift, but there were multiple times this game where he was just not an effective player here. And so as much as you really liked to see Celebrini and Smith and how they worked together, and while it wasn't entirely Goodrow's fault that this line didn't have a ton of success here tonight, he certainly didn't help, and he's certainly not a long-term or even short-term solution in this position. But as I said, because the Sharks are keeping this Lund line together, and because of the fact that the third line that they've put together here tonight actually had some success as well, I wonder what Warsofsky actually will decide to do. Is there a potential call-up from the Barracuda? That would be a bit of a stretch, considering I don't think the Sharks would want to run like Gushin with Smith and Celebrini. That might be a little too far off the deep end. But in this case, Goodrow is just someone who does not fit in this position. When it comes to the two other players here, I'll start off with Celebrini, who I thought, you know, by any standards for any other player here, like he outperformed Goodrow by like a factor of 10, but by his own standards, I do think he struggled at least a little bit here tonight. I talked about earlier on in the season that one of the major problems that Will Smith seemed to have is that he wasn't fully confident with the puck, it seemed. Celebrini, if you want to call this a problem, has kind of the opposite in the sense that he's almost overconfident with the puck, where every time he has it, he seems to think, I can make this play happen, I can make this pass, I could take this shot. And while he is incredibly skilled, and sometimes he is correct with those assertions, sometimes he's incorrect, sometimes he's trying to overforce these plays that he simply cannot pull off, not necessarily because he's not good enough, but sometimes the plays just aren't there. Sometimes there are sticks in those lanes. Sometimes there are players in his way, and Celebrini is just over-forcing. I've mentioned this multiple times thus far over these last few games, and it continues to be a bit of an apparent problem for him. What I do appreciate from a Warsofsky perspective is that Celebrini is not getting heavily punished for this. There have been many young players in the past on previous San Jose Sharks team who, when they would make even one aggressive move that would fail, they'd get benched for like the rest of the period or even the rest of the game. So the fact that Celebrini does this, it doesn't work out sometimes, and then he's right back on the ice for the immediate next shift, I definitely do appreciate from Ryan Warsofsky, and it will just be a bit of a learning curve, a learning process here for Celebrini. Most of the time in college when he would try to force these plays, they would work. Not going to be the same exact result here in the NHL, and so it'll be time until he actually manages to get it all together, but the obvious tools are there to make it work. And then when it comes to Will Smith, the final player on this line, perhaps for the first time this season, I actually thought Will Smith outperformed Celebrini. I've been a big fan of Will Smith over these last few games. He continues to just get better and better. I've been saying this a lot recently, but I feel as though this was perhaps now Will Smith's best game of the season. I would say this one assist that he had on the Tyler Toffoli power play goal was very, very impressive. I thought he'd end up taking the shot here, but the fact that he goes for this pass and he makes it work was extremely impressive. But even besides that, some of his work on the offensive zone was very, very nice to see. He worked off of Macklin Celebrini very, very well. We saw a lot of magic between these two players, even if it didn't always manage to lead to tons and tons of offensive success. The defensive game obviously still leaves a little bit to be desired. He still has some issues in terms of finding his spot in the defensive zone. When he actually engages in those like one-to-one coverage moments, I actually think he does a decent job of tying up his man, but it's more so reading the play in the defensive zone that he's a little bit slow on. But that'll come with more experience, with more time. At this point, it is at the very least a night and day difference between his performances earlier on this season when he was just so low impact and so invisible on the ice. Now he's actually a pretty good player for the San Jose Sharks, and he will hopefully just continue to get even better as time goes on. Moving on to the Sharks' third line, we have Dellandrea with Wenberg and Tyler Toffoli. It was just last review I was talking about how Toffoli had basically found himself on the Sharks' top line for the entirety of this season, even though he hasn't necessarily been all that great for the entirety of this season. But it did seem as though Warsofsky was leaning towards more lesser ice time, I guess, considering he only had about 15 minutes in the previous game, which is a good bit below his usual average. And indeed, that ends up being the case. It seemed as though Toffoli could have slid into a second line role with Celebrini and Smith, but instead he finds himself on a third line. You could kind of view this as like a punishment in the sense because he hasn't been playing all that well, but it actually ends up working out in Toffoli's favor. You know, as a player, he's not always really been the number one player on previous teams he's been on. When he started his career with the Los Angeles Kings, you would look at Andrei Kopitar and you'd look at Jeff Carter before you would look at someone like Tyler Toffoli. And so he thrives more so in that middle six type of role where he's able to actually get those mismatches and find that success. And I think that's what ends up happening here on this third line. There's more open ice to work with. He doesn't have to face off against Sidney Crosby on the ice or anything like that, and that allows him to not only get this power play goal, which was set up very nicely by Will Smith, not so much himself, but then managing to actually get this shot away on that second goal between like 4 different Penguins defenders was incredibly, incredibly impressive. So I liked Toffoli's game. It wasn't insane or anything. It's not as though he was exceptionally dominant, but he was definitely one of the Sharks' better players for sure. When it comes to the two other players on his line, I was also a fan of Ty Dellandrea. Weirdly enough, Dellandrea seemed to miss a few shifts in this game. I don't know if that was like due to injury or something, if he left the bench at a point or whatever, but there were a couple of shifts that ended up had like Luke Cunnin replace him. But when he was actually on the ice with these two players, I thought he was doing a very good job. We saw Dellandrea recently get promoted up to the Sharks' top line where that didn't really work because, like I said, tough competition when you are playing on that top line. But here on the third line, still with Tyler Toffoli, now he's able to find that success. He's able to use that speed, put himself in decent areas, and it was a great pass to Tyler Toffoli on that one. So a good game for Dellandrea for sure. And then when it comes to Alex Wennberg, I thought he was a solid glue guy here for this line. He did have a bit of a mistake, or honestly kind of a major mistake on the Puljujarvi goal. You can kind of go between whether or not it was his or Liljegren's mistake, but still you'd hope Wennberg would be a little bit more aware of that from a defensive standpoint, considering he's supposed to be a bit more reliable in that area. However, from an offensive standpoint, I thought Wennberg did his job rather well, and so this was a third line that was quite impressive for San Jose, and is something that they might want to go for more often moving forward. It just kind of, again, leaves that second line, and in particular Barclay Goodrow, a little bit out to dry. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we did have a substitution here. Nico Sturm got injured in that game against the Rangers, so Klim Kostin, for the first time in a while, steps back in. I kept a close eye on Kostin, and I thought his game was not great. He didn't make any major egregious mistakes. There weren't those terrible giveaways that had plagued his game earlier on this season and was the reason why he remained out of the lineup for multiple weeks in a row. But at the same time, it's not as though he was all that great. He did get one really good chance, but that was mostly set up from a really good play from Carl Grundstrom. Other than that, you know, it was okay, I guess. Basically, he's in a situation where if Sturm is healthy enough to play, he's definitely replacing Kostin. If not, I guess it's not the end of the world that Kostin's in the lineup, but perhaps the Sharks might make a call-up. We'll see. It would require them having to either put like Sturm on waivers, or not on waivers, on IR, or then put someone like Giovanni Smith on waivers to make it happen. It seems as though more likely than not, the Sharks will either keep Kostin around or hope that Sturm is healthy. When it comes to the other parts of this fourth line, Cunnin was a little bit invisible, didn't really notice him all that much, but Carl Grundstrom, I thought, stood out in a very positive light. He's actually been a bit of a driving force of this fourth line as of late. The one game recently where the fourth line has actually been actively terrible for the Sharks is the one game that Grundstrom was actually a healthy scratch in to give Giovanni Smith another look. So it feels as though he's been a big part of this fourth line, helping them work, and I thought tonight he was another solid game for him. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we have the top pairing of Thrun and Ceci. So we did see Wallman return to the lineup here tonight, but Thrun and Ceci had been more often than not quite good for the Sharks over these last few games, that they actually end up keeping this top pairing spot. And I think this was a fine decision from Ryan Warsofsky. When it comes to Cody Ceci, it was a bit of a weird game for him, because all in all, I would say he was relatively okay, but there were a few really boneheaded plays by Cody Ceci. Obviously, the one that sticks out really heavily is on that first goal by Brian Rust. Ceci's in front of the net, Rust is right behind it, and he decides to go for the challenge, which is fine if he actually attacks from the weak side, which would force Rust to the strong side where Thrun is defending, but instead he attacks from the strong side, which then leaves Rust completely open to go to the weak side, take this shot. Sure, Vanacek probably should have made the save, but still, I don't know exactly what was going through Ceci's mind in this moment. It's like a pee-wee hockey level mistake that he's made. But there have also been multiple confusing moments where there have been these miscommunications for Cody Ceci. We saw a couple times where he was a little bit out of sync with the rest of the team here, where he thinks one player is going to be somewhere and he makes a pass that is just going to nobody. And that's not even just the case for this game. We saw that miscommunication with Mackenzie Blackwood last game against the Rangers. I remember his awful giveaway due to a miscommunication with Mario Ferraro back against the Minnesota Wild about a week ago. So there have been multiple cases of this, but I guess generally he wasn't terrible here tonight. And then when it comes to his defensive partner, Henry Thrun, Thrun had some problems, especially handling some really tough players like Sidney Crosby. It's a very, very tough matchup to actually have. As I mentioned, Crosby on 599 career goals, one of the best players of all time for sure at this point, and Thrun is just kind of Henry Thrun. But I thought he did an admirable enough job. He was okay, I guess. And when it comes, I'll actually go to the third defensive pairing next for the San Jose Sharks, because that does feature Jake Wallman, the return here for him after he's missed a few games now in a row. And Wallman was honestly incredible. He was by far the San Jose Sharks' best defenseman. He was making such great plays, strong first passes out of the zone. Offensively, he was jumping in, he was being aggressive, not setting up a ton of great chances offensively, but still a useful piece in that area. He was just honestly great defensively, great all around. Definitely, I didn't seem to miss a beat from his couple of weeks off. So I imagine he might be able to work his way back up to that top pairing. Walman, it feels as though he's been so long having to face off against the really, really tough competition. Now that tonight getting the night off, in a sense, playing against weaker competition, he was able to excel as thoroughly as he did. When it comes to his defensive partner, Jan Ruda, I thought Ruda was okay. Obviously, I would have rather see Jack Thompson in this role, like I imagine many other San Jose Sharks, but Ruda, mostly because he was playing with Jake Walman, who was just so incredible here tonight, Ruda looked okay enough in this role. Probably one of his better games, even if that's not actually saying much. And then when it comes to the Sharks' defensive pairing, the second defensive pairing, we have Timothy Liljegren with Mario Ferraro. There were definitely some issues here when it comes to Liljegren's game. He was jumping up, he was being aggressive, I do appreciate that, but in the defensive zone, he found himself out of position a couple of times, as I talked about on that Puljujarvi goal. You could kind of blame Wenberg, but you can also definitely blame Liljegren. There was that great save that Blackwood was forced to make in the third period that Liljegren again was completely out of position for. So he's having some issues reading plays in the defensive zone, even though he is quite useful in terms of being that first pass out of it. And then when it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, I thought honestly didn't look that terrible. I actually thought he kind of outperformed Liljegren a bit here tonight. It's not to say that Ferraro was actually any good, because he was not, but his usual performance of like 2 on 10 or 3 on 10 improved to like maybe 4 on 10 here tonight, so I guess that's all right. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltenders, there were both who made an appearance here tonight, not because one was pulled, I would imagine, for performance reasons, but perhaps for health reasons. Vitek Vanacek lets in a couple of goals in the first period, but then also has a weird collision with Henry Thrun off of a miscommunication behind the Sharks net, so he did not come out to play in the second period, which was actually a bit of a blessing, because I don't think Vanacek looked all that solid to start this game. Blackwood comes in, and it was not a great goal to give up to Sidney Crosby. There wasn't a ton of traffic in front, so he probably should have been able to make that save, but then he had about 5, 6 insane saves, just absolute robbery on multiple Penguins players. Sidney Crosby multiple times here tonight. So he continues to really build up, honestly, that trade value. He's been so good for the San Jose Sharks thus far on a relatively consistent basis. He's had a couple of bad games, but more often than not, he's been really, really effective for them. And we have heard the trade chatter over these last few weeks about Mackenzie Blackwood, and with these types of performance, he continues to assert himself as a very interesting option for teams around the league to pick him up. And with a player like Yaroslav Askarov waiting in the wings there in the San Jose Barracuda for looking for that opportunity to perhaps get the call up, if the Sharks can find the right deal, and the right deal seems more and more likely to be able to show up with how well he has been playing, that could be something that the Sharks go for. But right now, another great game for Blackwood. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday. They'll be heading back home, at least for one game. They'll be taking on the Detroit Red Wings, a team that has been a middling performance thus far this season, I would say, for them. And we'll see if the Sharks can actually, start off better, not find themselves in a 3-goal deficit, which could perhaps lead to an actual 60-minute game for them. Class dismissed.